So this is something interesting that has been going on for a little bit. Jordan Peterson, whose meme is to clean your room and to not go out, protest, and do all this bullshit without first, attending to your own life. And I want to get to that, but I want to play this clip.
What would over look like? Well, we don't really know. And now what you see is this insistence on about a monthly basis that a new and radically different variant has emerged. And this viruses mutate all the time, but this virus particularly mutates, and there are small mutations and medium-sized mutations, numbers, let's say, and also effect, and larger scale mutations. When is that a variant? Well, how about whenever it's convenient for the pharmaceutical companies? Think, well, that's cynical. Is it now? The biggest lawsuits in the history of the American judicial system have been levied against the largest pharmaceutical companies on a regular basis for the last 20 years. And since when has it been a proposition of the political left that pharmaceutical companies necessarily have our best interests in mind? Now, I'm not particularly cynical about pharmaceutical companies. I think they have a hard job, both in terms of research and development and marketing and sales. And they're going to do what they can to market and sell. But that doesn't mean that they are now to be the arbiters of all public policy, because our politicians are too cowardly and incompetent to do anything but devolve their responsibilities to so-called experts, domain experts. Politics is not public health. That's medicine. Politics is the art of analyzing the entire situation and charting a course forward, all things considered. And for politicians to trot out the experts and say, follow the science, just means that they've abdicated their own responsibilities. And I think it's appalling.
Well, let me just say a couple things. First, the pharmaceutical stuff. Look, I don't know what the right solution is, but I have moved very leftward in terms of my economic perspectives, and I've moved probably rightward in my social perspectives, which I never would have anticipated. But if this is for the common good and shit, why is the government not getting some of the profits from Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson? The vaccines are free, right? So the government paid the companies to distribute the vaccine for their product. Why are we not getting some of that back? At least to just pay off the debt or some shit. Again, it's this weird divide where, well, the left generally is pro-vaccine and the right generally isn't for one reason or another, and that changes depending on who's president.
You can't trust the president and take his word and take a vaccine that might cause harm to us.
The vaccine's safe. Frankly, I'm not going to trust the federal government's opinion.
Let's just say there's a vaccine that is approved and even distributed before the election. Would you get it?
Well, I think that's going to be an issue for all of us.
But it's like the left was the number one voice against Big Pharma and big corporations. And now JP's taking the helm. It's like, that's fucking awesome. His other leftist arc is now supporting resistance in terms of mandates. So I got a couple tweets here. Montreal Awakens, protest this week. Okay. Mixer, clean your room. Well, now he's talking about going out and engaging in protest. Stop these insane restrictions now. Resist. Oh, what does it say? Oops. Resist, Quebecers. Enough is enough. He went with the hard R on the Quebecers. Should be Quebecers, but that's fine. Here's the deal. This is what I think is interesting. Because I think people will say, rightfully, well, Jordan Peterson is the guy who talks about cleaning your room and focusing on yourself, and this idea of like protesting and resisting, now he's being hypocritical. And I would say, again, that's understandable, but that's wrong, because there's no shortage of examples of Peterson talking about how, there is absolutely a space for social action. There's a space for protest.
I'm not suggesting in the least, and have never suggested, that there's no domain for social action. I'm suggesting that people who don't have their own houses in order should be very careful before they go about reorganizing the world.
And so that, this idea that, well, JP this is now hypocritical. It's like, again, one of the central points that he makes is, the left and the right need each other. And there's a time to be conservative and there's a time to be liberal. And that's dependent on the environment that you're occupying. So just like you want to be able to turn to the left and turn to the right if you're driving a car or navigating a ship of state, if we'll go with that metaphor, it's like you need to be able to move leftward or move rightward depending on the environment.
So you need the liberals. There wouldn't be high openness, low conscientiousness if there wasn't a niche for it. And you need the conservatives. And sometimes the liberals are right, the borders should be more open because that's their fundamental claim. And sometimes the conservatives are right, the borders between things should be more closed. And because they're both right some of the time, and because the environment keeps snaking around,
You have to have dialogue between the two sources constantly, so that the polity can orient itself as the snake of the environment moves. And that's why you need free speech.
And when pharmaceutical companies are deciding what the fuck we have to do, and being trotted out as experts, it's like, okay, it's probably some good time to start resisting some of that shit. And when there are mandates, which are being debated in the Supreme Court right now, it's like, that's also a good time to develop a more actually fuck this type shit. And there's a big difference between, you know, people who go out and protest and say, well, we want to implement socialism and we want to overthrow capitalism and the patriarchy and all that shit. It's like, that is a complete waste of time. Not necessarily because of the protest, but because the goal is worthless, right? That's ridiculous. To, you know, upend the entire structure of Western civilization when you are a college kid. But when you have the government enforcing a specific mandate on you, it's like, that's not the same thing. And that is a reasonable time to say, you know what? This is interfering with my individual life to the point where, you know, people don't want to get a vaccine that they don't believe is in their best interest. And fair enough, people have that right. I call myself unironically call myself an enlightened centrist, enlightened radical centrist, because it upsets people. But because it also reflects the reality that there's always a valid left-wing and a valid right-wing perspective, and you need to be able to shift between the two. And Peterson, this to me is him doing that. He's, you know, one thing he does a lot is defend hierarchies and defend capitalism and defend all this shit. But I think in some sense there's a lot of error in that, because clearly society is falling apart to a great degree. And, you know, his point about, well, society always has a corrupt aspect to it, right? The archetypal representation of that. The king always has an evil brother, right? That's an indication that the state can always become corrupt.
And the reason for that is the king always has an evil brother. And that means that the state always has a tyrannical element. And the tyrannical element exists for two reasons. One is the state deteriorates of its own accord. And that's an entropy observation. What that means is that the state is a construction of the past, right? But the present isn't the same as the past. And to the degree that the past is mismatched with the demands of the present, then it's tyrannical. It's malfunctioning. And so it's a continual problem with the state. It's always two steps behind the environment. And so then that means that the awareness of living people has to update the state.
And so when you have the pharmaceutical companies rolling out shit like this, the mandates and all that, we're clearly in a corrupt perspective. Then the question is, well, what do you do about it? And individuals can do what they do and say, how about, no, I'm not going to agree to these fucking vaccine mandates.